The chamber held 4,000 representatives from 312 species, and not one of them was paying attention when Ambassador Chen stood up. That was the thing about humans at the Galactic Council. 42 years of attendance, and they had become furniture. Reliable, ignorable. The kind of presence everyone acknowledged the way they acknowledged oxygen. Necessary in theory, invisible in practice. The Chelith delegation was reviewing trade quotas. The Varshan bloc was arguing about mineral rights in the Orion Spur. 2 Morellian attachés were doing something with their hands that might have been prayer or might have been a card game. Chen waited at the podium. She did not clear her throat. She did not tap the microphone. She stood there with her hands flat on the lectern, and her face arranged into something that was not quite calm and not quite anything else. And she waited until the silence found her on its own. It took 11 seconds, a long time to stand in front of 4,000 beings and say nothing. Humanity withdraws from all treaties, alliances, and obligations. Effective immediately. 9 words. Shen picked up her datapad, stepped down from the podium, and walked toward the exit. Behind her, the entire human delegation rose. 46 diplomats, aides, translators, and technical advisors stood in unison, gathered their things, and followed her out. Their chairs scraped against the floor. The sound echoed in a chamber built to absorb it. No one stopped them. For a full 30 seconds, the chamber held a kind of confused stillness, the way a body holds the moment between the cut and the blood. Then the Dravati ambassador laughed, a wet, barking sound. "The primates are throwing a tantrum," he said, loud enough for 3 sections to hear. Scattered laughter. The kind of laughter that checks whether other people are laughing first. Senior arbitrator Talverin Shou did not laugh. She sat in the elevated mediation tier, all 6 limbs folded beneath her thorax, and watched the doors close behind the last human aide. A young man. He had looked back once, not at the chamber, but at a spot on the wall near the Morellian section. Then he was gone. Talverin had brokered more peace accords than most species had fought wars. 300 years of reading rooms, reading silence, reading the space between what being said and what they meant. She had a sense for these things the way old sailors had a sense for weather. This was not a tantrum. The first hour passed in noise. Delegates argued about procedure. Was a unilateral withdrawal even legal? The charter had provisions for suspension, expulsion, sanctions, but voluntary departure? The document had no framework for a species that simply chose to leave. It had never occurred to anyone who wrote it that someone would want to. By the 6th hour, the noise had changed. Human communication relays across Citadel Station went dark. Not jammed, not malfunctioning, deactivated from the inside. Every diplomatic channel, every trade frequency, every emergency band linked to human infrastructure stopped carrying signal. The silence was not the silence of broken equipment. It was the silence of equipment that had been turned off by someone who knew exactly which switch to flip. Talverin dispatched a technical team to the Human Communications Hub on level 47. They found the doors open, the consoles powered down, and every workstation cleared of personal items. No datapads left behind, no coffee cups, no jackets draped over chairs. The humans had not left in a hurry. They had packed. Carefully. Completely. The kind of careful that takes weeks. This had been planned. By the 12th hour, the first real fear arrived. A Chelith systems engineer named Vordash requested an emergency audience with Talverin. He was shaking, all 4 upper limbs vibrating in a way that meant genuine distress in his species. He brought a maintenance report. It showed that human engineers had been running 31% of the Citadel's life support subroutines. not because they were assigned to, because over 4 decades, they had volunteered for shifts no one else wanted, patched code no one else understood, and quietly kept systems running that the station's official maintenance crews had given up on. None of it was in any treaty. They had simply done it because it needed doing, and they were there. Now they were not there, and the backup systems they had been compensating for were beginning to show their age. Talvarin ordered an immediate infrastructure audit. The results came back over the next 3 days, in a cascade that felt like peeling back the skin of the station itself. Human patch code in 40% of the water recycling systems. A human-designed logistics algorithm running cargo distribution for 9 species, all of whom believed it was Varshan-made. Human volunteer medics who had staffed alien hospitals during the Thessan Plague, a crisis the Council had officially declared was not humanity's concern. All of it volunteer work. All of it invisible. All of it gone. On the 72nd hour, the first 3 trade routes that depended on human-maintained navigational beacons went dark. A Varshan cargo fleet carrying mineral shipments worth more than some planetary economies dropped out of faster-than-light travel in empty space, navigation blind, calling for help on frequencies that no longer had anyone listening on the other end. Talvarin requested the complete record of human grievances filed with the Council over 42 years. The archive delivered 11,416 entries. She read them in her office, alone, in chronological order. The early ones were polite, formal, full of hope and careful language. A young species learning the system, trusting that the system would learn them back. The middle ones were firmer, more specific, citations of treaty articles, requests for review, repeated requests for review, the same requests filed again with updated data, the same requests marked as received and never answered. The late ones were short. Some were a single line. The last one had been filed 11 months ago. It read, "Acknowledged, no further action expected." Every grievance had been logged. Every grievance had been received. Not a single one had been resolved. Talvarin closed the archive. She sat in the silence of her office for a long time. Then she walked to the human delegation wing. The halls were empty, lights still on, automatic systems, not human ones, doors open, rooms bare. On the wall of what had been the delegation's common room, a drawing was taped at a child's height. Stick figures. One was clearly human, round head, wild hair, big smile. The other was taller, multi-limbed, with careful triangles for a thorax. A cellist, drawn by a human child who had grown up on this station, surrounded by species that had treated her parents as furniture. She reached out one forelimb, almost touched the paper, and stopped. She left it on the wall. She walked back to her office and began drafting the first emergency session in Council history, called Not Because of a War, Not Because of a Plague, Not Because of a Natural Disaster, but because a species had stopped volunteering. Lysanthe tasted the Council chamber before she entered it, and almost turned around. 400 species radiated emotion the way stars radiated heat. Constant, singular, readable. A frightened Varshan tasted like iron filings. An angry Dravathi tasted like burned sugar. Simple, one note at a time. Lysanthe's people, the Morellians, had evolved to read these signatures the way others read facial expressions. It was useful. It was manageable. Humans were different. Humans broadcast in chords. Fear and excitement at the same time. Grief braided with laughter. Shame underneath confidence, underneath tenderness, underneath something sharp and watchful that never fully went to sleep. The first time Lysanthe had tasted a human emotional signature, she had sat down on the floor of a corridor and stayed there for 10 minutes, overwhelmed by the sheer density of it. She had been assigned to the human quarter of Citadel Station as a junior cultural attaché, a polite title for a species-specific observer. Watch the humans. Write reports. Note anything unusual. She had noted many things. None of them had made it past her supervisor's desk. Now the human quarter was empty, and the council had assembled a task force to figure out why humanity had left. And Lysanthe was the only member who had actually lived among them. This made her simultaneously the most qualified person in the room and the one no one wanted to listen to. The task force met in a converted conference room on level 12. 14 representatives, a Chelith legal scholar, 3 Varshan economic analysts, 2 Dravathi military advisors, whose presence made everyone uncomfortable, but no one challenged. And Lysanthe, the only person present who knew that humans played a card game called poker, where the entire point was to feel one thing and show another. "What do they want?" the Chelith scholar asked. It was the first question. It would be the only question, asked in different ways, for the next 6 weeks. Lysanthe opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "I don't think they want anything from us anymore." The room did not like this answer. The room wanted demands, grievances, a list of conditions. The room wanted a negotiation. The room could not process the idea that a species might leave not because they wanted something better, but because they had stopped wanting at all. She was assigned to compile the cultural profile. 400 pages explaining human psychology to species that had spent 42 years living alongside humans without once asking how they worked. Lysanthe wrote it in her quarters, alone, surrounded by the few human objects she had collected over 3 years. A paperback novel with a cracked spine, a ceramic mug with the words, "World's Okayest Diplomat" printed on it, a gift from a human aide named Daria, who had laughed for 2 minutes straight when she bought it. A music player, loaded with something called jazz. She wrote about the poker nights first. 12 humans, crammed into a maintenance break room on level 31 every Thursday. Cards, bad food, worse jokes. Lysanthe had been invited once and had never stopped coming. She was terrible at the game. She could taste every bluff in the room. But the humans didn't care about winning. They cared about the table. The way it felt to sit in a circle and pretend the stakes were small. She wrote about Daria. Daria Okonkwo, maintenance technician, 3rd shift. Born on a colony ship, raised on Citadel Station, spoke 4 human languages and passable Chelith. She had fixed Lysante's atmospheric regulator at 3 in the morning because Lysanthe had mentioned once, in passing, at a poker game, that the humidity in her quarters made her skin itch. Daria showed up unannounced with a toolkit and a thermos of something she called terrible coffee, and fixed the unit in 20 minutes. She refused to bill the council for it. "It's just a favor," she had said. "That's what people do." Lysanthe wrote that line down and stared at it for a long time. Every day brought new discoveries about the scope of what humans had been doing, quietly, voluntarily, without recognition or compensation. A human software engineer had written the patch code running in 40% of the station's water recyclers. She had done it on her personal time after her official request to update the system was denied by the Varshan-controlled Infrastructure Committee. The code was elegant, efficient, unsigned. She had not put her name on it because she assumed someone would remove it if they knew a human wrote it. A human logistics team had designed the cargo distribution algorithm used across 9 species supply chains. They had offered it freely in a trade conference. A Varshan trade official had presented it as Varshan developed 6 months later. The humans had seen the presentation. They had not corrected the record. During the Thessan Plague, a medical crisis that killed 4 million beings across 12 systems, the Council had declared it a regional concern and limited the response to affected species. Human volunteer medics had gone anyway. They had no immunity to the pathogen. 3 of them had died. The Council's official record of the plague response did not mention human participation at all. Liz Anthe compiled it all. Every algorithm, every volunteer shift, every midnight repair job, an unsigned patch, an uncredited innovation. The weight of it grew until her document felt less like a cultural profile and more like a eulogy. On the third week, the task force asked her to present her preliminary findings. She stood before the 14 representatives and described what human emotions tasted like to a Morellian. Most species radiate a single emotional frequency at a time, she said. Clear, readable. Like a single instrument playing a single note. Humans are not like this. Humans are orchestras. They hold contradictions inside themselves and somehow make them harmonize. Joy and grief at the same time. Love and fear in the same breath. It should be noise. It is not. It is the most complex emotional signature I have ever encountered. The room was quiet. Not the attentive kind of quiet, the uncomfortable kind. In the last 6 months before the withdrawal, Lisanthe continued, the human emotional signature changed. The contradictions resolved. The chords simplified. Not into anger. I want to be clear about that. Many of you assumed the humans left in anger. They did not. She paused, chose her words with the care of someone handling something fragile. The chord resolved into something clean, cold, final. In Morellian emotional taxonomy, the closest equivalent is bereavement. Not the fresh kind, the settled kind. The kind that comes after you have already cried, and already screamed, and already bargained, and none of it changed anything. She looked at each member of the task force in turn. They grieved us before they left. They mourned the relationship while they were still in it. By the time Ambassador Chen stood at that podium, the humans had already buried us. The withdrawal was not the wound, it was the headstone. The room stayed quiet for a long time after that. The cellist scholar broke the silence. Then what do we do? Lisanthe thought about Daria and the thermos of terrible coffee. About a favor done at 3 in the morning, for no reason except that someone's skin itched. About a card game where nobody cared about winning. I don't know, she said. I don't know if there's anything left to do, but I know we should have asked this question 42 years ago. She returned to her quarters and put on the jazz. Something slow and broken and beautiful. She sat with the ceramic mug in her hands, world's okayest diplomat, and listened to the music the way humans had taught her to listen to it. Not with analysis, not with taxonomy, with her chest. The song ended. The silence after it was worse. Lisanthe set the mug down, opened her datapad, and kept writing. 400 pages. Every word a debt she was trying to pay on behalf of a galaxy that still didn't understand it owed anything. The coffee on the HSS Carthage was terrible, and Commander Rael Vasquez drank it like medicine. She stood at the observation deck of humanity's mobile diplomatic command ship, parked 3 light minutes outside Council space, close enough to monitor, far enough to make a point. The thermos in her hand was dented, scratched, and had survived 6 postings, 2 evacuations, and 1 incident she referred to only as Buenos Aires. It kept coffee at exactly the wrong temperature. She would not replace it for anything in the known galaxy. Beyond the viewport, the stars looked the same as they always did. That was the strange thing about severing ties with 300 species. The universe did not rearrange itself to match the occasion. Ships still moved. Stars still burned. The void was supremely indifferent to the fact that humanity had just told the largest political body in galactic history to go to hell. Rael had been the one to hand Ambassador Chen the datapad. She had carried the 9-word statement from the Joint Chiefs Secure Channel to Chen's office, had watched the ambassador read it twice, had seen something in Chen's face that was not surprise, but was instead the particular stillness of a person who had been waiting for permission to do something they had already decided to do. About time, Chen had said. Nothing else. She had stood, straightened her jacket, and walked to the chamber. Rael believed in the decision. She had spent 23 years in the diplomatic corps, watching humanity bend itself into shapes the galaxy found acceptable. She had translated insults into cultural differences. She had rewritten trade proposals until the unfairness was buried deep enough that no one had to feel guilty about signing them. She had smiled at beings who treated her species like a clever pet that had learned to use tools. She believed in the decision. She hated what it cost. Her comm unit chimed at 0400 station time. Rael checked the identifier. Kepler 442b, the research station. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds, a luxury she allowed herself before taking the calls that would hurt, and answered. Dr. Yuki Tanaka appeared on screen. Behind her, the sterile white of a medical bay. 6 beds, 6 children. The youngest was 4. Commander, we need the Morellian genetic database. The enzyme therapy, we have enough synthesized compound for 2 more weeks. After that, without the sequencing data, I can't. I know. These are children, Rael. I know, Yuki. The pause between them held everything that couldn't be said on an official channel. That the withdrawal meant the Morellians had sealed their medical databases. That humanity's parallel infrastructure program had stockpiled medicines and equipment for years, but could not replicate 40 years of alien genetic research. That 6 children on a rock orbiting a distant star were paying the price for a decision made by people who would never meet them. I'm escalating it, Rael said. Joint Chiefs, top priority. We'll find another pathway to the compounds. And if there isn't one? Rael looked at the doctor, at the beds behind her, at the smallest shape under the smallest blanket. Then I will personally fly to the Morellian border and beg. Decision or no decision. She ended the call, picked up the thermos, and held it against her forehead, cool metal against skin, and breathed until the shaking in her hands stopped. The Carthage was not a warship. It was a converted diplomatic cruiser, refitted over 6 years as part of a contingency plan that most of humanity's government had hoped would never be activated. It carried communication arrays, strategic planning centers, and enough supplies to operate independently for 18 months. It also carried 400 crew members who had volunteered for a mission that meant leaving everything behind the line. They were managing. That was the word Rael used in her reports. Managing. The colonial governors were furious. 17 billion humans across dozens of worlds, cut off from galactic trade networks overnight. Rael fielded their calls too. Governor Hassan of New Tangier wanted to know who was going to replace the Varshan raw materials his construction sector depended on. Governor Okafor of the Lighten colonies wanted to know if the Joint Chiefs understood that her people had been eating Chelith-grown grain for 15 years, and the human-grown alternative was 6 months from its first harvest. Rael understood. She also understood what most of the governors did not. That Earth's government had spent 8 years preparing for this. 8 years. The Parallel Infrastructure Program had begun as a classified study commissioned by the previous administration. Its findings were simple and devastating. Humanity had become so integrated into the galactic system that withdrawal would be economically catastrophic, but continued participation under existing terms would result in permanent subordination. The study recommended a third option: build alternatives, quietly, independently, create redundant supply chains, closed-loop economies, independent navigation networks, make withdrawal survivable. It had taken 8 years, 40 billion credits diverted from public budgets, and the coordinated effort of every human colony. The withdrawal was not a tantrum. It was a scheduled deployment with a launch date that had been set 3 years in advance. The galaxy did not know this. The galaxy expected desperate humans crawling back within weeks. When the Council's first formal envoy arrived at the Carthage, a Vartian trade negotiator flanked by Chelith mediators. They docked, expecting to find a ship in crisis. Rationing, tension, arguments, the preliminary leverage of a people who had bitten off more than they could chew. Rael met them in the main briefing room. She was wearing a clean uniform. Her coffee was terrible. She offered them some anyway. The Vartian declined. The Chelith mediator accepted out of politeness, and then spent 10 minutes trying to figure out how to hold the cup with 4 forelimbs. The Council recognizes the validity of humanity's grievances. The Vartian negotiator began, reading from a prepared statement, and is prepared to discuss a framework for... There's nothing to discuss, Rael said. The negotiator stopped, looked up. I appreciate you coming out here, Rael continued. It's a long trip, but I want to be clear about something so we don't waste each other's time. We are not negotiating. We are not presenting demands. We are not waiting for a counteroffer. The withdrawal is complete. Every species has a price, Commander. Rael tilted her head, considered the statement the way a person considers a stain on a wall, with mild curiosity and no personal investment. You're right, she said. We did have a price. For 42 years, the price was being treated like we mattered. We paid it in volunteer hours and unsigned code, and medics who died in plagues you told us weren't our problem. The price was respect. Not money, not territory, not power. Respect. And the galaxy's answer, for 42 years, was that the price was too high. She sipped her coffee. So, we stopped asking. The envoy left 4 hours later. They had arrived, expecting desperation. They departed in silence, and the silence followed them all the way back to Citadel Station, where it settled into the council chamber like a weather system that would not break. Back on the Carthage, Rael dismissed her staff and closed the door to her quarters. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk. Inside, wrapped in a cloth, was a Mirelian friendship crystal, a living stone that glowed with the emotional state of the person who gave it. Lysanthe had pressed it into Rael's hands 2 years ago at a diplomatic reception, both of them slightly drunk on something Mirelian that tasted like warm light. So you'll know, Lysanthe had said, even when we're far apart, you'll know how I feel. The crystal was dim, not dark, not yet, but dim in the way a candle looks when the wind has found it. Rael held it in her palm, felt its fading warmth against skin that still remembered what it was like to sit at a poker table on level 31 and belong somewhere that wasn't drawn along species lines. She put the crystal back in the drawer. She closed the drawer. She picked up the thermos and went back to work, because the decision was right, even when it cut, and the coffee was terrible, even when it helped, and there were 17 billion people on the other side of that line who needed her to keep managing. Doyen Kethamaru of the Vartian Trade Combine had not built a commercial empire spanning 47 star systems by being sentimental. His species did not have the biological wiring for guilt the way mammals did, that messy chemical soak that made warm-blooded creatures apologize for things that were strategically sound. The Vartian brain processed transactions, inputs, outputs, margins. A thing was profitable or it was not. A relationship was useful or it was discarded. This was not cruelty, it was clarity. And it had made Kethamaru the most powerful economic figure in the galactic community for the better part of 60 years. 6 weeks after the human withdrawal, that clarity was failing him. The numbers on his desk did not make sense. They should have made sense. He had modeled the human departure the way he modeled all disruptions, as a variable removed from an equation. Replace the variable. Rebalance. Continue. Humans represented roughly 8% of galactic trade volume. Significant, but not irreplaceable. 12% of technical labor. Higher, but distributable. The Vartian Combine alone could absorb most of the gap within 2 fiscal quarters. This is what the models said. The models were wrong. The first sign had been the Orion Spur Corridor. 3 of the Combine's highest value trade routes passed through a region of space where navigational accuracy depended on a network of relay beacons. The beacons were old, Council-era infrastructure, poorly maintained, except they had not been poorly maintained. They had been maintained perfectly for the last 26 years by a rotating crew of human engineers who had been assigned the task because no one else wanted to work in a sector that was 2 weeks from the nearest station. The humans had maintained the beacons and never once been late with an update. They had also, apparently, been running the beacons on modified software of their own design, because the original council code had been failing for a decade, and no one had approved the budget to fix it. When the humans left, the beacons reverted to the original code. The original code failed within 9 days. A Varshan cargo fleet, 18 ships, 400,000 metric tons of refined minerals, a combined value that would make a planetary governor weep, dropped out of faster-than-light travel in empty space. No navigation, no reference points, blind. It took 11 days to find them. By then, 4 ships had used emergency fuel reserves. The cargo arrived late, degraded, and worth 60% of its original value. Contracts were broken. Partners were furious. 3 colonial markets that depended on those shipments began to falter. Kathamaru was not a creature of panic, but he was a creature of pattern recognition, and the pattern he was seeing looked less like a disruption and more like a structure revealing that one of its load-bearing walls had been removed. He began to pull threads. The logistics algorithm that ran cargo distribution for the Combine's eastern sectors, Varshan designed, Varshan patented, the pride of the Trade Ministry. Kathamaru ordered an origin audit. The audit took 3 days. The algorithm was not Varshan designed. It had been created by a human team and presented freely at a trade conference 9 years ago. A Varshan official named Doret Ka had filed the patent 6 months later. The humans had known. They had said nothing. The agricultural supplements keeping 3 Varshan colony worlds fed during their 30-year soil reclamation project, sourced from a biotech firm on the Chelith homeworld. Except the firm's lead researcher was a human xenobiologist who had developed the supplement as part of a humanitarian project. She had signed over the intellectual property for free because people were hungry and paperwork was slow. Everywhere Kathamaru looked, he found the same thing: human work, human innovation, human labor, woven so deeply into the galactic system that removing it was not like pulling a thread, it was like pulling a bone. He called an emergency meeting of the Combine's Trade Council. 14 Varshan economic strategists, the sharpest minds in commercial governance. He presented the findings. The room was quiet. Then one of his advisors, old Threshik, who had been trading before Kathamaru was hatched, spoke. "We should blockade them." The logic was simple. Human colonial worlds still needed raw materials that only the Varshan could supply in sufficient quantities. Cut the supply, apply pressure, force them back to the table. Standard economic coercion. The galaxy had done it 100 times to 100 species. Kathamaru approved the blockade. It was the obvious move. It was the move that any rational actor with 60 years of experience would make. It was a catastrophic mistake. The blockade went into effect on the 43rd day of the withdrawal. Varshan supply ships turned away from human colonial ports. Mineral shipments halted, chemical feedstocks cut. The message was clear: come back to the Council or starve. On the 44th day, human colonial worlds activated supply chains that the Varshan had not known existed. 8 years of quiet preparation. Parallel mining operations on asteroids that the Council surveys had marked as low yield, because no one had bothered to check with modern equipment. Synthetic alternatives for 12 of the 18 key Varshan minerals, developed in classified labs on Earth's moon. Trade agreements with independent species outside the Council framework. The small ones, the overlooked ones, the 12 civilizations who had watched humanity get sidelined for decades and had been waiting for exactly this call. The human colonies did not starve. They did not even ration. Within 2 weeks, they were exporting surplus to their new bilateral partners, using logistics routes that bypassed every Varshan-controlled corridor. Kethamaru's blockade did not force humans back to the table. It accelerated the exact fracture it was designed to prevent. The 12 bilateral species, emboldened by human trade and terrified of being on the wrong side of the split, began formally withdrawing from Council trade agreements. Not all at once, one by one. A slow, methodical exodus that looked less like rebellion and more like species doing math and not liking the results. The Council chamber was bleeding members, and Kethamaru's blockade had opened the wound. He sat alone in his office on the 83rd floor of the Varshan Trade Ministry and pulled up a document he had never had reason to read before. The original Human Integration Agreement. 42 years old, the document that had welcomed humanity into the galactic community. He read it once. He read it again. He called Threshik, his most senior advisor. "Did we write this?" he asked. Threshik confirmed. The Varshan trade delegation had drafted the economic terms. Standard integration package for a new species. "These terms," Kethamaru said, "the Terra structure, the intellectual property clauses, the labor exchange ratios. Standard. Threshik, if I presented these terms to a new Varshan colony, to our own people, they would revolt." Silence from Threshik. "We charged them 4 times the standard tariff rate for market access. We claimed first right to any technology developed using galactic resources, which is everything, because we defined galactic resources to include the knowledge they gained at Council academies. We set the labor exchange at a ratio that valued 1 hour of human work at 1/6 the rate of equivalent Varshan labor." Kethamaru closed the document. His claws left scratches on the desk surface. Not anger. Varshan did not feel anger the way humans did. It was something else. Something closer to the feeling of a predator discovering that the ground it stood on was not solid. "They signed it because they were new, and they wanted to belong, and we handed them a contract designed to extract the maximum value from their desperation." "It was legal," Threshik said. "Yes. It was standard. Yes." Kethamaru leaned back. The view from the 83rd floor showed the trade district stretching to the horizon, ships moving, credits flowing, a system that had worked perfectly for centuries, because it had never occurred to the species at the top that the species at the bottom might stop showing up. He did not feel guilt. His neural architecture would not allow it. But he understood debt the way only a trader could, as a number on a ledger that grew the longer it went unpaid. And he understood, with the cold precision of a born predator, that the galaxy's most dangerous creditor was one who had stopped asking to be repaid. Not because they had forgiven the debt, because they had decided the debtor was not worth collecting from. Kethamaru dismissed Threshik. He sat in the silence of his office and began drafting a proposal. Not for the Council, for Earth. Directly, outside the framework he had spent his career defending. The terms he wrote were for the first time in 42 years, fair. It was not generosity. It was the minimum viable payment on a debt that should have been settled decades ago. And even as he wrote it, Kethamaru knew, with the clarity that had built his empire and was now dismantling his certainty, that fair might no longer be enough. 3 months. That was how long it took for the largest political body in galactic history to admit it had been wrong. Not in those words, of course. Political bodies did not use words like wrong. They used words like restructuring and reform and a new era of collaborative governance. But the meaning underneath was the same, and everyone in the chamber knew it. Talvarin Show stood at the central podium and looked out at what remained. The chamber that had once held 4,000 representatives from 312 species now held 2,600 from 290. 22 species had left for bilateral arrangements with Earth. Others had simply stopped sending delegates. Their silence, a vote, more eloquent than anything spoken from this podium in decades. The Dravathi blocks sat in their usual section, armored and rigid, still pushing for military action against human space. Their proposal had been voted down 3 times. The margins were shrinking. Fear did that, made the violent option look less insane every time the rational one failed. Talvarin had spent 300 years believing that all conflict was a failure of communication. That if beings of good faith sat across from each other long enough, understanding would emerge like light through water. She had built her career on that belief. She had mediated wars with it. She had held the council together through plagues and trade collapses, and the slow grinding friction of 300 species trying to share a galaxy. The belief was not wrong, but it was incomplete. Communication required 2 parties willing to speak. It also required 2 parties willing to listen. And for 42 years, the Council had spoken to humanity in the tone of a parent addressing a child who should be grateful for what it was given. The humans had listened. They had listened carefully. And then they had decided that the conversation was over. Talvarin gripped the podium, 6 limbs, steady. "I am not here to assign blame to any single species or delegation," she said. "I am here to acknowledge a systemic failure. Not a failure of communication, a failure of character." The chamber shifted. That word, character, was not diplomatic language. It was personal. It landed like a stone in water. For 42 years, a species contributed to this community with generosity that we repaid with indifference. They filed 11,000 grievances. We acknowledged every one. We resolved none. They maintained our infrastructure, developed our technology, staffed our hospitals during crises we told them were not their concern, and we responded by treating their labor as background noise. This was not an oversight. Oversights are corrected. This was a choice, made daily, by every delegation in this chamber, including my own. Let the silence do what silence does. I am proposing the dissolution of the current charter and the convening of a constitutional convention to draft a new framework for interstellar cooperation. And I am proposing that this convention include an empty seat, reserved, waiting, for as long as it takes. The vote took 4 hours. It passed. Barely. The Dravathi voted against it. So did 11 other delegations. But it passed, and that night, the charter that had governed galactic civilization for 900 years was formally suspended. The empty chair was placed the next morning, human-sized, simple, metal frame, fabric seat. It looked small in the vast chamber. It looked enormous. Lisanfe resigned from the council task force on the same day. She packed her belongings, the paperback novel, the ceramic mug, the music player, into a bag that a human would have called a backpack. She requested passage to the border of human space aboard a Myrelian transport vessel. Not as a diplomat, not as an attaché, not as anything official at all. Her supervisor tried to stop her. "You're the council's foremost expert on human psychology," he said. "Then the council should have listened to me when I had something to say." She carried the cultural profile with her, 400 pages, printed on physical paper because humans liked paper, liked the weight of things in their hands, liked objects that could be dog-eared and coffee-stained and carried around until they fell apart. She had bound it herself in a cover made from Myrelian textile, a material that changed color with the emotional state of the person touching it. A small gift, a small honesty. The transport brought her to the edge of council space, where the relay beacons went dark, and the stars continued without anyone's permission. A human patrol vessel scanned her ship, confirmed she was unarmed, and hailed her with a message that was polite and absolutely devoid of warmth. State your purpose. I have a document for Commander Rael Vasquez. It is personal, not political. A pause, long enough to consult someone, long enough for Liz Anthe to taste the distant emotional signatures of the human crew. Careful, controlled, tired, and underneath all of it, a thread of something she could only describe as homesick for a place that still existed, but no longer felt like home. Proceed to Docking Bay 7. You will be escorted at all times. Rael met her in a corridor that smelled like recycled air and bad coffee. She was thinner than Lysanthe remembered. The thermos was in her hand. Buenos Aires, dented, eternal. They stood 3 feet apart and looked at each other the way two people look at each other when the words available are too small for what needs to be said, and too large for what can be safely felt. You came a long way, Rael said. I wrote something. Lysanthe held out the document. 400 pages. The Morellian cover shifted colors under her fingers. Grief blue, affection gold, fear white, all moving like light on water. I wrote it so someone would remember what you gave us, even if you never come back. Rael took it, held it, felt its weight. Is this an official council document? No. This is from me. Rael nodded. She tucked the document under her arm. She did not open it there. Some things deserved a closed door and an honest reaction, not a performance for the escorts standing 10 feet away. Thank you, Liz. It was the first time in 3 months that anyone on the Carthage had used her short name. The familiarity of it cracked something in both of them. Lysanthe reached into her bag and produced the ceramic mug. World's okayest diplomat. She held it out. Daria would want you to have this. Rael took the mug, looked at it. Her jaw did something complicated. She's on Kepler 442b, Rael said, transferred to the research station, keeping things running. Of course she is. They stood there a moment longer, two people on opposite sides of a line that neither of them had drawn, and both of them had to respect. Then Lysanthe turned and walked back to her ship, and Rael walked back to her quarters, and the corridor was empty again. Rael read the document that night. All 400 pages. She read about poker nights and atmospheric regulators and the taste of human emotions. She read the section on human music, where Lysanthe described it as wounds shaped into something you could move your body to. And she set the pages down and pressed her palms against her eyes, and sat like that for a while. The Myrelian crystal was on her desk, out of the drawer. She had taken it out a week ago and not put it back. It was dim, flickering, not dark. She picked up her comm unit and composed a message to Earth's Joint Chiefs. 1 line, attached, the full 400 pages. They're not all the same. Some of them listened. Kethamaru's bilateral proposal reached Earth on the 91st day. It was the first formal communication from a sitting council member directed to humanity outside the council framework. His trade partners called it weakness. Kethamaru called it an invoice. I am paying what we owe, he told his council. The terms are fair, not generous, fair. If that constitutes treason, then this institution has defined loyalty as the obligation to remain in debt. The terms were accepted as a basis for discussion, not agreement. Discussion. It was the smallest possible step forward. Kethamaru understood that. He also understood that it was the first honest step the Varshan had taken toward humanity in 42 years, and that honest steps, like all first steps, looked small from the outside and felt enormous from within. The Constitutional Convention opened on the 97th day. The chamber was smaller, the species fewer. The debates were raw and graceless, and occasionally devolved into shouting, which was something the old council had never allowed, and the new one could not afford to prevent. Alive. The empty chair sat in the human delegations section. Every morning, a Chelith maintenance worker checked that it was clean. No one had asked her to do this. She did it because it needed doing. On the second day, a technician in the communications center noticed something on her instruments. A new signal. Human frequency, originating from beyond the border. No voice, no message. No demands or conditions or ultimatums. Just an open channel. A frequency, active and waiting, carrying nothing but the soft static hiss of a connection maintained. Listening. Talvarin was informed within the hour. She stood in the communications center and looked at the signal readout. A single line of activity on a screen full of silence. And felt something she had not felt in 3 months. Not hope. Hope was too simple a word for a being who had lived 3 centuries and watched civilizations rise and fold and rise again. The raw, unfinished, terrifying potential of something that had not yet been decided. She returned to the convention floor. She did not announce the signal. She did not tell the delegates. Some things were not ready for politics. Some things needed to exist quietly before they could exist at all. She took her seat. The debates continued. The empty chair waited. And somewhere beyond the border, in the dark between stars, a frequency hummed, patient, open, carrying nothing but the willingness to hear whatever came next.